Hello, today we're going into the number side of logic. Of course, this is going to have equals, greater thans. No math today. We're going to be trying to stay away from the math. Just a little bit of math to change numbers, maybe just addition, subtraction, but not much math. So you don't need to worry about that. But today we're just going to be looking at simple greater thans, less thans. And we're also going to be looking at some switches. Switches are very helpful. I'll explain later on why we need switches and why they're better than, let's say, an if chain. So first, let's go to our first example, our greater than. Alright, so here is our first example. What's happening is every time we press it, it's going to display how many times we've pressed it until we hit 10. Once we hit 10, it'll reset. So here are our circuits. And let me explain what is gonna go on when we press the button. So what we have here is every time we press the button, so every time we press this, it outputs an execution. And what we're doing is we're adding one to our variable. As you can see right here, this is going in to add 1. Every time we press it, we add 1 to itself, and we check if this is greater than 10. Remember, our if is kind of like a question. If our integer is greater than 10, then we're going to set to 0. So every time our integer gets greater than 10, we set it to 0. Alright? And this right here, we're just setting the text every time our integer changes. That's all we're doing right there. So let's go over this again. We press it, we're adding 1 to the integer variable here. Alright? And once we add 1, we check, is it greater than 10? If this integer is greater than 10, so if it is, then we set it back to 0. That's it. And over here, we're just, every time the integer changes, we output this. So every time this is added to 1, this is outputted as well. It sets the text to whatever our integer variable is. So that's our greater than. This is how numbers are in play for variables. Alright, here is our second example. Here we're using a less than. So what's happening here is the same thing, but we're going downwards. And then once we hit 0, we go back to 10. Same thing as last time, but all we're doing is once we press it, we're subtracting 1 to our integer, and we're saying, is it less than 0? Alright, so if it is less than 0, then we set it back to 10. Alright, so let's go over that one more time. Subtracting and our if is just like a question. If our integer is less than 0, if it's less than 0, then we set it to 10. Else, well, we're not doing anything with our else right now, but that's what's happening. So if it's less than 0, then we set it back to 10. Alright, so that is our less than. Next, we're going to go into our equals. Alright, so here is our equals example. Basically what's happening is every time we click the button, if it's equal to 0, then we set it to 10. If it's equal to 10, we set it back to 0. This is going to set us up for our switch. So what we're doing here is every time we press the button, we're checking if it's equal to 0. If it is, then we set it to 10. If it isn't, we go down to another if, and we check if it's equal to 10. And if it is, then we set it to 0. So here is our question of our ifs. Our question here is our integer equal to 0? If it is, then we set it to 10. If it isn't, then we check, is it equal to 10? If it is, then we set it to 0. Alright, so one more time. Every time we press it, we're checking, is our integer equal to 0? If it is, then we set it to 10. If it's not, we go down and we check, is it equal to 10? If it is, then we set it to 0. If it isn't, we don't do anything. Alright? But Switches help eliminate asking two questions. Technically, having all these extra chips here, all this right here is going to be one chip. So let us go into our integer or our switch example. So here is one of our switch examples here. So what's happening here is we have like a little sassy button here. Alright, every time we click it, it'll be like, hey. It'll have these different things to say depending on how many times you've clicked the button, and it goes back, it repeats. Alright, so what's happening here is, like before, we're adding one to our presses here. That's our integer here. We're adding one to it. And we have our new chip here, value integer switch. So here on our value integer switch, we can configure it and we can add numbers to compare it to. We'll look at that in a second, but basically what we're doing here is we're having a number output here every time we add, right? So this is outputting, and what we're doing here is we're checking, is it equal to 1 right here? Is it equal to 2? Is it equal to 3? And so on. And if it's not equal to any of these, it'll output default. So if it is equal to one of these, then it'll output here. So right now it says listen to the button, so that means it is equal to none of these and it's outputting default. But if I click it, this is outputting 1. Hey, 1, and it's outputting here. So let's look at our outputs we have here. 1, outputting hey, because it is 1. So instead of having an if or equals, we have an integer switch. Alright, can you read is now equal to 2. So basically our integer switch is it equal to this. And over here we have the same as before, greater than or equal, you know, going back to, that is an integer switch. Now let's look at how we can configure an integer switch. So let's configure this, and I'll delete all of these. Alright, so like this, if it doesn't equal anything, it'll output default. If I configure it, I'm going to add something to compare it to. Alright, so let's say 1, as we're adding by 1, so it's going to pass 1. Alright, so now we have data here we can output. Because I've wired it to a text, which is a string, it'll output string. But let's say I want to, instead of that, I want it to be integers. I can output integers if I need. Just any kind of data, booleans, floats, any kind of data you can input. But for today, we're using string. So our default is going to be, let's say, look. Alright, so when it's not equaling 1, it'll say look. So if it is equal to 1, we're going to make it say hi. Alright, so now let's change this to be 2, actually 3. Look. Alright, now it says look because it's not equal to 1. But now if I press it and add 1, it's equal to 1 now. Let's look at what we're outputting, 1. Now it's outputting 1. Now it's going back to 0. Alright. That is an integer switch. Now let's look into an execution integer switch. Alright, so here we have our execution integer switch. We're doing the same thing here, like a little sassy button. Not really sassy this time, but using an integer execution switch. Or an execution integer switch. So we're doing the same thing here. Every time we press it, we're adding 1. Alright. And we're checking, is it equal to 1, is it equal to 2, and 3. Failed is the same thing as default. If it's not equal to any of these, it'll output failed. So what we're doing here is, if it's equal to 1, then we're making execution go out to set a text hello. 2, stop, hey. And if it's none of these, it'll set it back to 0, and it will say hi. So right now it's 0. Click it, it'll go to 1. Because it's equal to 1, it went to set text hello. So if I press the 2, now it's 2, and if it's equal to 2, right here, it says stop. And now it says stop. Now 3, so he's outputting 3. We're going through here. We found 3 right here. Goes down, set text to say hey. It's saying hey. Now I'm going to add 1. Goes back to 0 because when we clicked it, we added it 1 more, which went to 4. And none of these were 4. We don't have a 4 here, so we failed. Which we're just going to output our default execution. Alright? And this default execution went over here, set it back to 0, and made the text say hi again. That is our switch. It's just executions. It's just an if with equals. Equals ifs. It's just equal ifs. That's what we have here. Equal ifs. Same thing as what we had over here. But instead of this, we can change it to be an execution integer switch. So what we're having here is we're going to do the same thing. The exact same thing. So if it's equal to 0, output there. If it's equal to 10, output there. Every time we press this button, we'll do this. Now it does the same thing, but less chips. This is what an execution integer switch is good for. Less chips, and you could say if your list gets really long, less heat. You don't need to worry about heat right now, as that is later on. Alright, I hope you guys learned a little more from this video. If not, you can always pop down a comment, tell me what you were confused about. I can always help you. If you need, I can make another video going more in depth into that one part that you're a little more confused about. But today was just a little more execution integer switches and greater than. So you don't need to understand everything right away, as everyone learns differently. Everyone has their own learning style. So it's okay if you don't understand it fully. You're not dumb or anything. Everyone learns differently. So I hope you seek help if you need it. I'm always here. Drop down a comment. If not, pop down something you want to learn. I'll always do a video on it. I love teaching people. That's why I run my own class. But I'll see you guys next time. Bye.